If ever we get a sense that God is calling us into a new season in our life, or asking us to undertake a new ministry or activity, or even completely change the direction our life is heading in, it can be really difficult to follow God's call, can't it? Especially if that involves making difficult decisions. I remember many years ago in the 1980s, probably before some of you were born, to be honest, but in the 1980s, there were a group of people being held hostage in Beirut in Lebanon. And most of those hostages we knew were still alive because there were some photographs released of them and other information was coming out about them. But there was one hostage in particular called Terry Waite, who was taken hostage and nobody knew if he was dead or alive. And he was actually in captivity for over 5 years. Now, at the time, I worked for a supermarket. I wasn't a vicar then. I've been a vicar 32 years, but I wasn't a vicar then. I used to work for a supermarket. And I was absolutely convinced that Terry Waite was still alive. And I used to go to church on a Sunday, obviously, but I also used to go to church on a Wednesday morning as well, a communion service. And during that period, Terry Waite was in captivity. Every Wednesday morning, I used to take communion on his behalf. I figured that if he was still alive, then he wouldn't be able to receive Holy Communion. So I said to God, okay, well, let me take it. And if there's any benefit that you can transfer onto Terry Waite, then please do so. And I never missed a Wednesday for the whole of that 5-year period. And at work, during that time, I was offered a promotion, a really sizable promotion and a really good pay increase as well. But the catch was I would have to work Wednesday morning. So I had a really difficult decision to make. Do I take the promotion? Do I take the pay rise? Or do I turn it down and carry on taking communion on behalf of Terry Waite? Well, I prayed about it a lot and I thought about it a lot. And I turned down the promotion. I turned down the pay rise. I decided that actually, no, God wanted me to commit to carry on taking communion on Terry Waite's behalf. And it was a tough call. It was a tough decision, but I genuinely felt that it was God's call on my life at that time. Now, it's really hard to follow God's lead, isn't it? And to be faithful to him when we've got these difficult choices. So how do we make the right choices? How do we follow God's lead and follow his call on our lives? Well, today I just want to run through 3 very simple principles, really. And I want to take them from the life of St. Joseph, Jesus' stepfather, and to think about the events surrounding the birth of Jesus and what we can discover from Joseph's life to help us through thinking about how best to respond to God's call. We don't often focus on Joseph, do we? To be honest, he's a bit of a bystander, really, in the Christmas story, or the way that we celebrate it. Anyway, we tend to at Christmas time focus on Jesus at Christmas, obviously, and we focus on Mary as well. Most of the sermons you'll hear, most of the reflections you'll hear are on Jesus and Mary, and of course, even in the carols that we sing at Christmas time as well. Not much mention of Joseph at all. But Joseph, I think, gives us an extraordinary example of how to follow God's call on your life. And we can't even begin to imagine, can we, what Joseph went through during that period of his life. He was betrothed to Mary, and the excitement he would have felt at that betrothment, of course. A period of betrothment was marked at the beginning by the signing of a formal contract, intent to marry, and the betrothal period lasted for a year before the wedding actually took place. So we can imagine that period of time, Joseph would have been so excited. He would have had so many dreams for the future. He would have had his own vision of what his life was going to look like. And then, of course, that excitement gets replaced by shock at the news that Mary is pregnant. All his dreams would have been completely shattered. He would have been estranged socially as well. Friends would have fallen away. because of the humiliation that he was going through. And Joseph would have been under real pressure to end his relationship with Mary. So the excitement turned into shock, and then the shock turns into confusion. In verse 20 of Matthew chapter 1, we're told that Joseph considered all these things. So he was thinking through the implications of what was going on. And he had three choices, really. Firstly, he could expose Mary for supposed infidelity. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, there was given the option to expose a woman who was deemed to have been unfaithful. But in the Old Testament law, of course, that woman would then face the possibility of being stoned to death. So Joseph thought long and hard about this. And the second option was a far more compassionate one. The second option was to divorce Mary quietly, so as not to expose her to shame and humiliation and even the threat of stoning. But to divorce her quietly may have been the compassionate thing to do. Or the third option, of course, would have been to carry on and then to marry Mary as well. So he considered all these things and decided on that final option, of course. So he was excited, and then that moved into shock and then confusion, and then that must have given way to fear, because in Matthew 1 verse 20, the angel says to Joseph, "Do not be afraid." Well, you only say that to somebody who's afraid, right? So he must have had real fear for the future as well. So excitement, shock, confusion, fear, and then he moves into God's future for him. He follows God's call on his life. So what do we learn from Joseph, and how can we respond to God's call on our lives? Well, the first, I think there's three lessons, and the first lesson is this, is that when we get a sense of God's call on our lives, we must just resolve to follow him. It's as simple as that. Just in our heads, resolve that we are going to follow him. In Matthew 1:24, we read that Joseph did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him. And so he made that resolution within himself. Yes, he heard God's call on his life, and no matter what, he was going to follow it. And there was something very courageous about the way in which he followed that call on his life. Because in verse 25 in Matthew 1, we read this, that Joseph did not consummate the marriage, which is amazing. What happened was he decided he was going to follow God's will, going to follow the call of God on his life. And then it's like he stepped back and didn't even have any physical relationship with Mary during that time, so that God could be glorified at the outcome. He wanted God to receive all the glory, and he wasn't going to create any air of ambiguity by having physical relationship with Mary during that time. So he stepped back, and he felt God's call on his life. And even though he was going to be socially estranged, and even though he was going to be humiliated and embarrassed in public, he stepped back and allowed the situation to unfold in such a way that God would be glorified at the end of it. But of course, he didn't know exactly how this was going to resolve itself. And I think that when God places his call on our lives, he doesn't give us specifics. He doesn't tell us the exact detail of how it's going to unfold. When God calls us to leave somewhere and to move into a new season of our life, we don't always know where we're going, and God is vague. That happens throughout Scripture. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, for example, God said to Abram, go to the place that I will show you. He didn't tell him where it was. He didn't tell him how he's going to get there or how long the journey would be. He just said, go to the place that I will show you. And of course, when Jesus called his disciples as well, he just said, follow me. He didn't give them any specifics. He just kind of gave them this vague call that they had to respond to. And I think that's how it is with us in our lives as well. When God calls us onto a journey, um, He doesn't give us a map. He doesn't give us a detailed map of where we are to go. Instead, He gives us a compass and He says, head due north. And so we set out on this journey with God in our lives, not knowing specifically where we're going, but heading out in a general direction in the faith and the confidence that God will lead us to the right place at the right time. Now, as on all journeys, if we want to head due north, that's great. But, there may be obstacles in the way. So sometimes we have to go a bit east, or sometimes a bit west, or sometimes we need to backtrack south again and go round an obstacle. And that's what the spiritual life is like. It's not just heading in one linear direction with God. He wants to get us due north. But the journey itself has lots of twists and turns, and we never quite know what is around the corner. So Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7, doesn't he, that we walk by faith, not by sight. And I would say to you that if you sense God's call on your life at the moment, resolve to follow him, but don't wait for the specifics. Just like Joseph didn't wait for the specifics. If you sense his call, then just go, okay, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. I'm stepping out in faith, but you need to guide me and show me the specifics. There's a lovely proverb, isn't there, in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, which says this: trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. So hold on to that promise if you are resolved to follow God's call in your life. Secondly, we learn from Joseph and his part in the Nativity story that if we are to follow God's call on our lives, we need to put Jesus at the very centre of our story. That's what Joseph did. Jesus was at the heart of all of his decision making. Care for Jesus even before he was born by going to Bethlehem, care for Jesus by escaping Herod and fleeing to Egypt, care for Jesus by then returning to Nazareth, and care for Jesus then by nurturing him as a child into maybe adolescence, we don't know, but training him and teaching him and mentoring him to be a carpenter as well. So Jesus was at the very centre of Joseph's story. And if we are resolved to follow God's call on our lives, we need to make sure that we put Jesus at the very centre of our life story. If we hold Jesus at the centre, then we can't possibly go wrong with God. You might have heard of the athlete Eric Liddell, who was a British runner, and he was at the Olympics in 1924, and he was due to run in the 100-metre race, and he was expected to win and win comfortably. But he then heard that the preliminary heats were going to be run on a Sunday. Now, Eric Liddell was a Christian, and he didn't think that was the right thing to do. So he actually withdrew from the 100 metres instead. And he then later during the Olympics ran in the 400 metres instead, which wasn't really his distance. But not only did he win the gold medal, he also broke the world record as well. And just before that race started, an American, a US athlete came up to him and gave him a note with 1 Samuel 3 verse 20 written on it, which said, "Those who honour me, I will honour," the words of God to Eric Liddell. And then he won the gold. He broke the world record. And then he went to China as a missionary, and he ended up as a prisoner of war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And he was still leading people to faith even before he died in that camp in February 1945. But he is a wonderful example to us of somebody who put Christ at the centre of his story, even when it meant that he had to make a very difficult decision and not run that 100-metre. And look how God blessed the rest of his life and the rest of his ministry as a result of that. So if we want to follow God's call on our lives, Joseph teaches us first that we've got to resolve to follow God. Secondly, that we are to put Jesus at the very centre of our story. And then thirdly, I think we learn from Joseph that if we want to follow God's call on our life, we need to remember that sometimes the best decisions in life are also the hardest decisions for us to make. In verse 21 of Matthew 21, Joseph is told by the angel that Jesus will save people from their sins. So Joseph realized that even though this was a really hard decision for him to make, the decision would be worth it, because actually the birth of his child would then change the course of human history. It was a tough decision for him to make in the circumstances, but that tough decision was the best decision because of that transformative nature of what his son would go on to do. I mentioned at the beginning that I turned down that promotion at work so that I could carry on going to church on a Wednesday to receive Holy Communion on behalf of Terry Waite. Well, what happened when I did that? My boss, where I worked, and the deputy boss were both absolutely astounded and stupefied that I should make that decision. They couldn't believe that I was going to turn down such a good promotion and such a good pay rise. And they asked me, really, why are you doing this? And I told them the story. I gave them my testimony and told them about God's love for me and my desire to serve him. As a result of that, both of my bosses became Christians. Isn't that astonishing? So 2 people were converted to the Christian faith through me making that decision. And I then ended up being a priest in the church as well. Didn't take the promotion, and then God took me out there into full-time Christian ministry. So sometimes the toughest decisions are the best decisions. We never really know what God is going to do if we remain faithful to him and follow him in our lives. In Philippians 4, verse 13, Paul writes that I can do all things through God who strengthens me. And that's the same, it's true for you as well. You can do all things through God who strengthens you, even if that means making tough decisions in order to follow God's call on your life. If you do that, if you are faithful to God's call, then God can achieve anything through you, through your faithfulness to his call. So God strengthened Joseph and gave him the resolve to follow his will. God strengthened him by putting Jesus at the centre of his story, and God strengthened him to make hard decisions that turned out to be the best decisions. And God will do the same for you as well. So if you sense God's call on your life at the moment, don't wait until you've got a sense of all the details of what God wants from you and where he wants to take you. Just be prepared to resolve yourself to step out, put Jesus at the centre, make the tough decisions, and see how God will then bless your life, but also use you to be a blessing to others.